Hello and welcome back to today's personal finance show here on Dublin City FM with me, Paul Merriman from askpaul.ie. So as I said before the break, I'm joined in the studio today with a really good guest, which is Tomas Kelly, who is the Vice President of the SCSI Chartered Surveyors Ireland. So, just to explain, Tomas, why don't we just go through at a very high level what we're here to speak about today for our guests. So we know it's housing, we know it's the rebuilding cost in particular. So why don't you give us a little bit of background to your recent publication?
Sure, thanks Paul, and delighted to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you.
I suppose what we're here to talk about today is the SCSI Cost Rebuilding Calculator for, I suppose, homeowners and consumers that are looking to reinsure their property in the years ahead. And I suppose we publish this guide every year, and it's a really useful guide, I suppose, that people can touch base on and recap on what they need to do.
Yeah, it's a really good calculator too, and it's something that's really important. And I mentioned this last week on the show where I was teeing up that you were coming into the studio this week. I did mention that many moons ago I started my career in Royal and Summit Alliance, well over 25 plus years ago, and I was in the household and motor department. So it would be typical answer phone calls, giving people quotes. There was no internet back then, so when we were doing that, people never really, when they were looking for their home insurance renewal, they might take it out with the bank or the broker when they're getting their mortgage, say 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. And then when they go to move it, they use the policy that they have. So you might take out 300,000 worth of cover 5 years ago. They're going to get a reprice today. But that 300 probably needs to be 350 now is basically what you're getting to.
Yeah, essentially, I suppose, like all insurers, none of us let the letter coming through the inbox, and we just pay it and say it has to be done. But in the case of home insurance particularly, you really do have to study it and consider it and make sure that you're covered adequately. Yeah,
and that's a big thing. It's that kind of inertia factor, isn't it? It's there, the renewal goes through, I might have a discount because my car's there and you're not bothered with it, but you should be bothered about it. You need to look at the renewal and find out by using your calculator to see, have you insured your property for enough? Yeah. So what do people need then in order to get how much they should need? What's the basic information they need? Because if I'm a people go to these kind of sites or calculators, they kind of, the first thing they're asked for, they don't know what it is. So why don't you bring people through what information they should have to hand?
Yeah, so I suppose if you go to our website, scsi.ie, it'll bring you to the calculator and the guide. And that sets out some very clear instructions in terms of the assumptions and the limitations. But in terms of the information you need, the first thing you'll need is to measure your home to understand and determine what the area of it is.
Okay.
So,
and most people might know this or know how to measure it, but they might have the brochure when they bought the property, would have typically had it. The BER cert, I'm guessing, will have it as well. Does it, when you get your BER, do you know?
It could well do.
I'm just thinking it might too, because a lot of people know, but is there a quick way of measuring your home?
Yeah, well, I suppose I suppose I should say from the start, the guide deals with speculatively built homes. It doesn't deal with one-off homes.
Oh, of course,
or period properties. But most speculatively built homes are square or rectangular, essentially. So you measure with a tape measure from the inside face of one external wall to the other, and you measure the breadth and the depth, and you calculate it. Now, of course, upper floors usually are the same area, so you add it up for each floor if there is more than one floor. And if there is extensions for a kitchen extension, you add that on.
Very good.
It's fairly straightforward. Yeah.
So once you've measured your house, next of all, what information you need? Presumably your air code and where your location is.
Well, actually, no, you don't need that for this, because I suppose one of the problems is, and I suppose it's kind of relevant because we're talking about the local property tax in recent weeks, and there's a confusion or misconception. People shouldn't equate, I suppose, the market value of your property, which you do need for the local property tax, with reinstatement costs, because they're fundamentally different measures and no real direct correlation.
So, but would I right in saying that I'm obviously wrong, I would have thought that if I was getting a house reinstated down in, I don't know, Kerry compared to Dublin, it might have been a different price, but you're saying no, it should be the same cost right in regards where you are.
Well, no, I suppose what I meant was it's not air code specific.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, it's not air code specific.
No, but we have 7 regions in the calculator.
Yes, that's what I meant. So you pick your region.
You pick your region,
Yeah, okay, very good. And then that was going to give you a reinstatement clause. And let's talk about what happens if you don't do this. Let's use the example, because I think a lot of people don't know this. If you have your reinstatement value, it should be 500,000 and you've only got building insurance, say, for 400,000. So, 20% of the difference. If something happens to your house, your kitchen burns down or something goes wrong, you're only going to get 8%, 80% of that claim. They're not going to give you the full 100% check because technically all the house is 80% underinsured.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a common mistake, I suppose. People think, if there's a fire in the kitchen, sure, I have 500,000
exactly
to cover the repairs.
Yeah.
But it doesn't work like that because home insurance has what's called an average clause.
Yes.
And in simple terms, if you have a claim, you will only get the proportion of that claim that's equivalent to the insured value versus the real reinstatement cost. So as you say, if it's 20% underinsured, you'll only get 20% of, say, it costs you 50,000 to repair the kitchen, you'll only get 40.
Yeah, okay. I think that's the biggest thing because I think people think, right, the house is never going to fall down or it's never going to really... Okay, the fire is obviously the biggest one you need to be thinking of, but they're thinking the whole house might go up. Yes. So yeah, they might have enough cover. You don't need a full level of cover. Yeah, so that's a big one. So the big tip here, your renewal comes in the post. Make sure you look at what you have your cover for. Go on to SCSI.ie, fill out the calculator, make sure they match. If they don't, you need to increase your cover. Yeah.
So SCSI.ie, and I suppose you put in your floor area that you've measured.
Yeah.
Put it in square meters. Don't put it in square feet or you get a big surprise.
Yeah.
And then I suppose it does provide provisions then, because it's a speculatively built home, you can and you have the option to include a top-up value for higher than average building fittings, such as maybe you've done up the kitchen or the like, or if it's external works, you also have the provision to include an amount for sheds or offices and the like that you might have in the garden.
Okay.
So once you have all of that inputted, then you'll see the cost per square meter for each of the different regions.
Okay.
So you pick the region and that gives you the approximate figure.
And then let's talk about, so if you look at from your recent publication, we're saying that there's a 7% national rise in house rebuilding costs. And then that's particularly Dublin as well. So let's stick to the Dublin region. Is that just because of inflation and the cost of material? That's literally what we're still dealing with here.
Yeah, I suppose there's a combination of factors. And as you say, just to speak to Dublin, really, Dublin is 5%. The national average is 7%, but this year the Dublin average is 5%. And I suppose there's a number of factors, inflation definitely, both in materials and in labour costs, particularly labour costs, because I suppose if you're in the residential space looking for labour, you're competing with a lot of demands on construction workers, be it industrial, commercial and the like. And so if that level of demand is increasing and the supply isn't, that's going to put pressure on prices. So it's labour, it's materials, plant and fuel, the cost of doing business. We know traffic around Dublin can be a problem, and that all feeds into the costs. And I think also, I suppose, different building standards. We're seeing standards improve all the time, be it environmental standards, to greater energy efficiency. So all of those factors combine, to push up costs.
Yes, going to push them up and make a difference. Okay, but and then can we just again talk about anything else that you feel that the consumer would need to know when it comes to rebuilding that we haven't covered? Just make sure we're really square this off for them. Yeah,
well, I suppose some of the pitfalls we talked about there were the market value versus reinstatement, and we also talked about underinsurance. But other pitfalls, I suppose, would be people don't necessarily realise that your rebuild insurance doesn't include for contents. Or all risks insurance for, say, valuable items that you might...
Watches and jewellery, etc.
You might be going on holidays, and if you lose your watch or whatever, that's not covered. So you need to have specific amounts for contents and all risks separately from that.
But some of them would provide for a non-specific as well, don't they? So policies will give you, say, 3,000 or 5,000 of a non-specific. You don't have to identify the watch if it's under 5,000 or whatever it is.
Exactly, yeah. But that's why you need to read the small print.
And you know what? This is where, and I know we don't actually advise on home insurance or motor insurance at AskPaul and Fairstone, but I know from my own experience, I think you need to go to a broker. In my opinion, trying to buy this type of insurance online, and I'd never buy one off a bank. I know you're going to get the discounts and they might say the first 20%, but the policies usually aren't as good, and you want to make sure you're paying for what you need. And I think people think of it, I think people think of this as a box ticking exercise, and therefore they don't really care. It's when they're getting the mortgage, whatever the bank wants the rebuilding cost to be is what they'll put down on it, and they never look at it again. So it's so important when that renewal comes in that you take it serious, you spend the half an hour, and I would go to a broker, a really good broker, and being able to ask them, what do I need? So what do we actually, this is my circumstances, this is the jewellery, this is, I go on holidays or whatever else comes across.
Yeah.
and making sure you have the policy, because, okay, it might be 20% more expensive, but it means you've got the right cover and the best cover. Because there's so many things that people don't realise home insurance covers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think shopping around is key.
Yeah.
You know, go to your broker, absolutely.
Yeah.
But, you know, there's so many portals online now. You can do checks as well. And I think there are a lot of different things with insurances, you know, excess, for example.
Yes.
What excess, you know, can you reduce your premium if you increase the excess? Stuff like that.
And so just for listeners, excess means the first proportion of a claim you'll pay. So if your excess was €1,000 versus €500, you typically have a cheaper policy, but you would have to pay the first €1,000 of any claim.
Yeah.
Usually bring people through that. But yeah, it is it is good to shop around, think about these things, and making sure that you're just getting bang for your buck. I think that's so important. Lastly, to touch on this, you did say this at the beginning of the interview, but let's just talk about market value versus the reinstatement clause, because this is really important. So if you have a property in Dublin and the estate agent says it's worth €700,000, that's not your reinstatement value.
Absolutely.
Because that's the land, that's the property rather than the actual building.
Yeah, and there is no rule of thumb or direct correlation between the two. So in one instance, your reinstatement might be more than your market value, and in other situations, the market value could be greater than your reinstatement. So, for example, if you build a property and you build it to your own unique tastes, let's say, you know, you might love it and more power to you, but the reality is, if it's got all sorts of quirks and follies, it may not sing to the tune of the market. Yeah. And so, you know, there's all sorts of different variables that you'll get. Yeah. And so they shouldn't be thought of in the same context at all. Yeah.
And I would also encourage people, when you are doing your home insurance renewal, make sure you look at the questions correctly. Like, they want specific locks on windows and doors, and have you got the house alarm and smoke alarms, etc. It is important that if you have got an alarm, you are using the alarm too, because if there is a burglary or something goes wrong and the house hasn't been alarmed, you've received a discount for that alarm being in place. So it's important to make sure the house is protected, not just against fire or damage, actually against theft as well, because that's how everything's covered for. I suppose lastly on this then, when we look at the actual cost of driving this up, we're saying 5% for Dublin, 7% nationally. Just your opinion while you're in studio, because on this show every week we end up invariably talking about usually Donald Trump and then secondly the housing crisis. Am I right in saying, if you're saying to us today that, look, 7% nationally for rebuilding costs, that it makes sense that is definitely what would you be looking at for kind of, I think, the cost of increasing in property in general? So if you're looking to build a house today as a builder, they're not the same cost as what you're looking at for a rebuilding cost, aren't they?
Yeah, there wouldn't be a million miles apart, you know, but like we do, the SCSI publish a tender price index, which is addressing the commercial market as opposed to the residential market. And so this year, for example, it's averaging about 3% per annum. So what you find if you look at this example, and they are apples and oranges, but this is more 5% in Dublin or 7% nationally. Because it's so labour intensive rebuild work, it tends to be more heavily leaning on the labour costs. So the labour costs are higher. So it's a single site usually, rather than having the scale that you'd see in a commercial development. Exactly.
So you're still looking at kind of 3 to 5%. I think this is really interesting, because I can't see that slowing down anytime soon, because of, you know, I think that continued pressure on inflation will rise, even if it's just 2 to 3% nationally, which I think was going to, in turn, throw it into the in on top of the issue, which is the housing crisis that we have, that you can just see these prices just getting, more expensive every year as we go by. I can't see it finishing for quite some time.
Another point, just in terms of the differential, the government introduced a land levy, and a recovery levy. So that's introduced €10 a tonne, which doesn't sound like a lot, but obviously if you're demolishing a house, there's a large volume. So it'll impact on rebuild work much more than it would be on normal commercial.
Okay. And then that's hardly going to have to be considered in your reinsurance, is it, when you're insuring your property again? Well, do you need to cover the levy? Do you have to mention that? So say you think property costs $400,000 to rebuild on the square foot, the levy's not, you're not provided to cover that in your insurance, are you?
Well, you are, but the SCSI calculator factors that into.
Does it?
Yes.
Okay, so I missed that part completely.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So that really covers everything.
Yes.
Okay. So the levies do have an impact then on the cost of insurance as well, how much you have to do.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So as I say, it's minimum for a speculative build, standard specification, and if you have higher spec, then you have the provision to add on.
To be able to increase on. Okay, listen, Tomas, thanks a million for coming to the studio. I really appreciate your time. It's been really good information for our listeners today, so thanks again.